Well, welcome, friends, to See, Hear, Love, and to our third episode of our 4-part special series called SOS, Summer of Strength, where we're featuring 4 outstanding women who embody courage, faith, resilience, and expertise in leadership, health and well-being, soul care, and journeying well through grief and loss. And our hope is that our stories and our conversations will strengthen, encourage, and inspire you, our listeners, to live authentically, to live courageously, to live a life of joy and possibility, and to deeply love God and others. And so today we continue the series with a very special guest, Stephanie Morales-Beaulieu, and she's the author of Anything But Ordinary, Finding Faith That Works When Life Doesn't. Wow. And it's inspired by her dad's life-changing divine encounter that profoundly influenced the Too Short journey to his death from ALS. And Stephanie is a born communicator, a lover of God's word, with a contagious love and enthusiasm for Jesus, and hails from Alberta, Canada. Stephanie, welcome to See, Hear, Love.
Thanks so much for having me, Melinda.
How are you doing? How are you doing today?
Good. You know, it's a good day. It's a good day to be alive.
Yes. I love that. You know, a lot of times, you know, when I ask people that, immediately they want to tell the hardship, and it's a hug and all the reasons why the day isn't good. It's rainy, it's bad, I'm feeling achy, my perimenopause, my bones are achy, all of that.
Yep.
But I love how you started. I think that every day we should look at it in that way.
Yeah.
And hope for
the
good too.
You know, it's funny. I started the day, you know, I open my dishwasher to unload it, and I was like, forgot to turn it on last night. I don't know if you do that. And you're like, you know, and now you don't get to start the day with a clear counter, but I put the soap in and I thought, you know, it can still be a good day. It can still be a great day. So that's true.
I love that. And, you know, for me, in just response, it's like, I'm just grateful I'm here. I'm grateful that I'm actually alive, and I've lived all of these years. Not always joyful, because there's been challenges, but to be alive and here and doing what I'm doing, so grateful.
The gift. Yes.
It's such a gift. Well, Stephanie, I really wanted to feature you in our SOS series to strengthen our community as we really navigate the journey of losing a parent, as we navigate loss and grief, disappointment. And for so many are asking, why, God, where are you? Why are you letting this happen? And so I think it's perfect for you to come on to really strengthen us this summer, because I think in like my age range now, so many of my girlfriends are in this like sandwich generation. They're taking care of their kids, but also now taking care of their, you know, their parents. So this is really, really timely. And I'm so glad that you're with us to help us kind of navigate through this. So let's start from the beginning, the story of your family. Your dad immigrating to Canada, and a little bit about you so we get to know who you are.
Yeah, so I am half Filipino. I get asked that all the time, and it's funny how people ask it, and you probably know this. They're like, so what are you? Or what's your heritage? Or like, what's your ethnicity?
Yeah.
And so my dad is Filipino and my mom is Canadian. And so a big thing with Filipinos is like the nose. So when I tell people I'm half Filipino, they're like, no, you don't have the nose.
Yeah,
and
the nose.
I've had Filipinos tell me like, you're not Filipino. And I'm like, no, I am. So I definitely grew up kind of just in that mixed basket of I'm a little bit of this, but not all the way that, and a little bit of this. But I grew up in a family where I was loved, you know, I was seen, I was known. And my dad came to faith in Christ when he was 37, the age I am now, and had a pretty radical encounter. I was only 4 months at the time, so I never knew my pre-Jesus parents. I've heard stories about them, which were honestly impossible to believe, you know, as I knew my parents in their life after Christ. But they'd gotten married in the early 80s. They had all the challenges of a cross-cultural marriage and, you know, when you try to do things your own way. And then my mom had a pretty life-changing encounter with God just in her living room one day of going, you know, I have everything I wanted. I've got 2 healthy babies and 2 cars and a nice house. Like, why do I feel so unhappy? And so that was the beginning of her, you know, coming to Jesus moment and her weakness and brokenness. And then she prayed for my dad, thought he'd never get saved, thought nothing was happening below the surface. And little did she know that God was at work. And so about 15 months after she got saved, he had his come to Jesus moment and really had a 180.
Wow.
like surrendered his life, and just sin began to fall off, began growing like quite rapidly in his faith, and felt a call to ministry pretty early. So our family moved from Richmond, BC to Cochrane, Alberta for my dad to go to seminary. And so I grew up, I was the pastor's kid, grew up in the church, like grew up just in a very different kind of environment than my parents did. So that was kind of I guess the foundation for my faith was theirs. And then of course, this diagnosis was the beginning of a season of, I need this thing to be really real, not just what I read about.
Wow. It's always interesting because, sort of the pre-Jesus and then Jesus and then post-Jesus.
Yeah.
It's so interesting because, especially when you're older, like you meet people and you're like, oh my goodness, they like embody all that is good and of God. And then they're like, oh, you should have seen me in my 20s. You know, and you're like, what?
Really?
No. But then, you know what? Stephanie, it's not like, for me, like people meet me now, and if they haven't heard my like testimony or story, they would have no idea the prodigal years,
right?
The bad decisions I made in my 20s, and choosing not to follow Jesus, and then here I am. Like if people don't know that, if they haven't journeyed with me, and it's so I'm like, oh, I have like a pre-Jesus, now Jesus story
with
too.
Jesus.
With Jesus, right?
I know. And I think that sometimes we look at those stories and we go, oh wow, like they have this dramatic, real encounter, and and if your journey's like mine, more of a slow, steady sunrise of truth, and then it can feel like my story's not as cool or not as interesting, or it's not as boring, or it feels boring. But I think when you hear those stories, it's like, right, God really can change people, and that's so encouraging when you're in that place of like, is it possible? So I think that all stories, can be used for God's glory.
Yeah, I think that's really good because I've heard that from people, because my story is so dramatic and kind of coming back to God. And some people, when they hear me, they're just like, oh, my story is not like that. But I'm like, but it's your story, and it's your story with God. It's like your story, his story with your story. So, no matter what it looks like or what you've been through, there's always something there that somebody can connect with. It's like the power of story no matter what.
Absolutely. And I remember always saying to my mom growing up, I'd always say, oh, I wish I had your story, because it was this death to life, like darkness to light. And I will never forget when she said to me, no, I wish I had your story.
Wow.
And I think if you have a quote unquote boring story, you forget, in the trying to follow the rules and trying to stay on the straight and narrow, the pain of sin. And my mom, because part of the reason she had all these rules for us was because she'd experienced so much pain and guilt and shame that she didn't want us, to go down that same path. It's like, I've been there, I've done it the world's way, and I can tell you it's not good. And so I think that always really resonated with me. So if there's someone listening who feels that, like, oh, I don't have this, dramatic, it's like, whatever your story is, like you said, it's you and God, and he'll use it.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And it's good reminder for people to know that.
Yeah.
Like every story matters. Every story has a connection point, and every story, is with God as he's working in and through you. And I love it. Yep. That's so good. Yeah. Let's talk, Stephanie, about your dad's diagnosis of ALS. First of all, what is ALS? How did that happen? And then kind of the response, how it affects body and mind, and the journey for him and you and your family through this.
Absolutely. So when I got the call on May 5th, which was, I had no idea how 3 little letters could alter our lives so completely. I didn't know what it was. So when the doctor said I have ALS, I had no idea what he was talking about. I had no idea what was ahead, but I knew when he said it's fatal, I knew what that meant. So that was very jarring. And of course, as I started, you Google, and the more I learned about the disease, the more I thought, oh, this is bad. So it's a neuromuscular disease. It stands for amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and it basically attacks the voluntary muscle system. So your physical body and your voluntary muscle system dies off slowly. So I would call it death by 1,000 losses. So things that you don't really think about, like swallowing, speaking, like telling your fingers like to tie your shoes or to cut your food, all of those kind of from the outside in just begin to slowly die off until you're kind of left in this really kind of vegetative state, except your mind is totally intact. And so in a way you end up trapped inside of this body that like won't listen to you and won't do what you're trying to tell it to do. So it's a really cruel disease. And when he was diagnosed, when you would tell people, the first question was, what is that? And kind of the sad thing now, when you say ALS, most people go, oh, like I know somebody, or I have someone in my extended family. So now it just everyone, seems to have been affected at some degree of closeness. So of course, when you get that kind of news, I think the first natural question is why?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Why me? I remember my mom, why me? Why our family? Why this? Why now? And she shared something really powerful. She shared it, over a number of years. And she said she came to a point where she realized having the answer to why would not actually erase her pain. And so she began to shift, and she talked about shifting from questioning why to what now, God? And I recently heard somebody say a wise question to ask in these seasons, which I think we just don't in our flesh. We want to know why, we want to control it, we want to change the outcome. And this person said, we should ask God, what does obedience look like in this season?
It's good.
And that is a really kind of humbling, hard question, but a wise question, because the good news about suffering and even a fatal diagnosis is that you still have an opportunity to trust God, to exercise faith, to hold on to his promises. And, if you read scripture, there's a lot about God caring about us holding on to faith, and so I think something that we can easily miss sometimes in the emotion and the shock is, what's the opportunity here? What's the opportunity to take God at his word, to believe he's who he says he is. He can do what he says he can do. And so, of course, there was, probably a week of not getting out of bed and just waking up thinking I was in the middle of a bad dream, and then remembering kind of all over again, oh no, this is real. This is happening. So there's, of course, that. And that comes in waves. I think sometimes we think grief is like, I'll be sad one day, and then the next day I'll be a little bit less, and then a little bit less. And we kind of expect it to be linear, but I found it would be, I'm feeling okay. And then all of a sudden, boom, like something would trigger sadness or thinking about something in the future. And then this burst of grief would kind of come. And so I have found it more, the grieving journey to be that way, rather than a little bit better than the day before, in kind of a gradual linear process.
Wow. I think that's so honest. Why? Were you ever angry at God? Like, did you direct your family at God for allowing this to happen?
That's a great question. So in my family, I'm kind of I would say the fun optimist. Like that's my personality. And so I was not by any means like trying to put like a positive, spin on things. Like, I mean, when there's grief, you have to give that credit. But what happened when my dad was sick was, okay, so first of all, it was 2008. So the internet and texting and group messages, like all that wasn't possible. Mass communication was not what it is today. And so the phone at our house was ringing off the hook, and my mom was getting really exhausted from just relaying the story, every update, like over and over. So at the time I said, oh, Mom, in my university class, there's this new thing called a blog, and
a
it was
blog.
like, it's where you can write stuff. And so I just sort of, to try to help my mom, I was like, I'll start a blog about this, so you can just direct people there. You don't have to repeat it, right? It takes so much emotional energy to do that.
Right.
And so that became kind of like my job, and we lived 3 hours away, so we couldn't be there for every day. But that was kind of how I could help. Mm-hmm. And so I found, though, very quickly, it's like nobody wants to read just constant bad news, where you read it and it's like, this is depressing and this is, so I think in that writing is kind of therapeutic in its own right. Mm-hmm. And so as I would write the updates, I felt like I was always trying to find the glimmer of hope, like what's the good thing God's doing in the midst of this. Mm-hmm. And so it began as just kind of a straight up prognosis update blog. And then it began to kind of also capture the stories of hope, I guess, and like where God was working and how he was using my dad through like in the caregivers and different kind of things. So for me, I think there was probably moments of anger, but I wouldn't say that was my dominant emotion at that time. However, when I went to write the book, different story. 13 years later, with a certain measure of healing, I would say, but going back through the story slowly, and the 15 months he was sick was fast.
Yeah.
And so to write the story kind of was like to re-enter it. And because the story started with his life, it's like I got to spend time with my dad. I got to know him. And then it was entering the diagnosis like all over again. And then reliving all of the losses. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So a lot of I would say anger came a little bit like more like a storm, I would say, actually in the writing process, which ironically, you think 13 years later, I had a woman say to me, like, did you not grieve, when your dad was sick? But I think as much as healing is in layers as you go through your life, I think grief is too. Grief is too. And so I had a lot more, I remember when I was writing the day he was diagnosed, May 5th, it was the anniversary, and lots of May 5ths had come and gone without a big bunch of emotion. And that year, I just remember everything feeling so fresh. I remember actually, like, my husband came home from work and I was just sitting in my van in the driveway, and I'd gotten home, my kids had gotten out, and he's like, "Are you okay?" And I said, "No." And I was like, "I gotta go." And he's like, "Where are you going?" And I said, I gotta go. And I remember, like, I got in the van, I was driving across town, and I just screamed like,
yeah,
like, just all of this, like, it just feels like so much, and like revisiting the story feels so hard, and like, and I felt like that was where God started to just like, it's okay, let it out, like, just, it's okay. And so for me, the anger came quite a bit later, and there was like several months in the writing journey where that was not where I parked and like set up a tent, but I would visit and feel very much, as it came.
Yeah, Stephanie, it's good. It's good, honest feeling, because I think, for just recently, my husband and I, kind of journeyed with a friend who lost his wife. She was only 47. And we were encouraging the layers of grief and the expression. And sometimes in a North American culture, the and the wailing and crying is like, no, we don't do that. Like, we keep all of our emotions in, and we're very like calm. And even in the, at the funeral home or at the graveside. And there is something, and speaking to friends in other cultures, that is needed to express, to wail, to lament, to grieve, to scream. Like, that's part of healthy grieving. To be angry, to be sad, to feel and to sit in your body all the emotion. Like, it's so important for us. And I think that's something that maybe we should, in this conversation, for those listening, to give permission. Go for it. Go out there and scream. Cry. Go in your fetal position. However, not to stay there long term. But I think there's that and the layers of it where, like, for you, it's like years later then you're angry. But I think that's really good to remind people. I also think, and as I was listening to you as well, I think the part about what your mom said, the answer to why, isn't, that isn't the question. And, my husband, former pastor, he also was a former funeral director. And so he's understood and been in those spaces. And he said, something we were talking about, he said, Stephanie, even if we got the answer to the why, it wouldn't be enough for us. It actually wouldn't help us. It wouldn't make sense to us. If God literally said, okay, I'll tell you why your parent is suffering, and he gave us the answer, it wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't be good enough. It would maybe make us more angry. It wouldn't satisfy us. And so I think that's that relationship mystery of suffering, of life, of why God doesn't answer in the way that we want. Because I think there is that where you talked about the exercise of faith and this idea of hope and digging into the relationship with God in suffering. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think, and I say this because I'm speaking to a lot of my friends who are listening, in permission, but also maybe probably the why is for you to exercise faith, lean into God more, lean into family, community. Maybe that's it, more than why is it happening. And that sucks. It's a sucky answer, I'll be honest. It's a sucky answer.
That's all we were.
Like, people are probably like, Mel, that's not helping me at all. But what I'm saying is I'm trying to process it through for them as well. What do you think of that? Like, as I'm saying.
I think absolutely. And I think that, like you said, I talk with, when I share this story, I've just had the privilege of hearing a lot of women's stories and talking with women. And so much of the time what I hear is, I'm afraid to go there. I'm afraid
for sure.
If I go there, if I allow myself, if I lose control, like what will happen? It feels like this black hole of, like, will I come back? Will I be okay? And I think that there's this freedom in letting go and just trusting that God is who he says he is. He's not going to leave you or forsake you because you're angry at loss. And I think we forget too, like, Jesus did that. Like, one of my favorite stories is when Jesus came on scene. Lazarus has died. He sees his friends grieving. And I mean, for crying out loud, he's about to resurrect a dead man. If there was a time to say, wipe your tears, like, you're going to be fine, stop crying, just wait like 4 more minutes, that would have been it. And yet Jesus wept. It's like he saw the grief, he saw their pain, he saw like life. I didn't make it to be this way. It was supposed to be lived forever. We intuitively have this, like, death, it's not supposed to be this way.
Yeah.
And yet Jesus took the time to enter into his friends' pain, to grieve with them, to weep, to be deeply moved. And it doesn't really tell us how long that took, but he did that before he went to the miracle. And that's so important to me. I think when we think about how do we grieve well, how do we walk with people who are grieving, it's like that's part of it.
Yeah.
And something that was so impactful for me, and this happened about 5 years before my dad was sick. There was a woman who's, everyone in Filipino culture is Auntie Goodwill, and she lost her baby girl when she was 9 months old to meningitis. And 2 things that are permanently etched in my soul. One is the sound of her wailing at the graveside. And just that, like you're talking about, that deep, like this is breaking me.
Yeah.
It's like there's no words. There's just the sound of grief. And I, like, when I think about it, I still feel emotional and it comes up. And not but, because I think but cancels out what you just said. But the next Sunday at church, I remember I was like I was probably 18 or 19 when this happened, and I was sitting behind the drums, like on the worship team, and I saw them drive up. I saw out the window, and I saw them get out, and I saw there was no stroller and there was no car seat, and I'm just like, in my gut, I'm like, oh. And she came in, and of course everybody, it was a small church, everybody has walked together. And I think my dad invited her friend and said, is there just anything that you want to say? Or, and I remember her standing up there and tears were still streaming down her face. And it was obvious that it was fresh and real. And she said through tears, I'm here to tell you that God is faithful.
Yeah, that makes me emotional.
And that, and I remember saying, if she can say that, after, like, I had heard the grief. I thought, if she can say that, it has to be true. Like, it is true. Like, if that woman who's gone, and experienced this loss and this grief, and that, I mean, her testimony, I mean, like, when we got the news about my dad, that was, I mean, you better believe that was, that was there in the forefront of my memory of going, but remember, she said, and if she can say that, then you can too.
Yeah.
And so I think it matters, what we say about our seasons. It matters what we speak about God, because you never know, like, what faith is sowing seeds of faith into other people.
Yeah.
And
that's
so I
powerful.
think that it's just important to give space for both, and to trust that if we do go there and we do feel the emotions and we let out our deep cries and our laments, that, like, God's not leaving us in that moment. He's not upset about it. There's freedom for that. And there's also healing, when we're willing to go there.
Stephanie, that's so good, because there's so much going through my head. Because, there are the people who something bad has happened. Yeah. And that has been the catalyst to say, no more God. There is no God. I'll be angry at God forever. Cut off. Mm-hmm. And so we have that camp of people.
Yeah.
Then we have the people who are God is good. Everything is good. I'm okay. I have to be happy because that's what God is. And that's what I have to be joyful and blah, 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 blah. And you're like, that's not true too, right? Like, that's not true either.
No.
Because Mel, if I say that he's not, then I could wipe out all the people who are following Jesus, because if I am not that faithful warrior and say these things,
so happy all the time.
All the time, it's all on me. Okay, that's not good. And then I think there's the truth of the real emotion, and God is not going to be like, I can't handle this. Like, come on. Like, first of all, I think, you're too much for me, and that's just way like, oh my goodness, like you're so not a good follower. This, our relationship is broken because you feel these emotions. Exactly. Like, no, that means that you have a very small view of God. Like, so like, wake up, everybody. Like, what you're doing is you're putting God in this little small way of seeing him, but also maybe our own family of origin, how we view people, and we put that on God and poor God. Like, God, guys, time out and stop, right? And I think this is such a good conversation because there's kind of like the balance of, we do dig into God is faithful. Because we know our relationship, we know who he is. But also the real raw emotion that God can handle it and be true and real. Like, that's what God wants. He wants a real, true relationship with you. Just like in any marriage relationship or friendship, you want the true, authentic person. You don't want somebody to front all the time and try to be perfect. Like, that's not a relationship, and that's exhausting. That's exhausting to have that kind of friend.
People want real.
People want real and honest. So like, in this space of your grief or loss, be angry at God, be upset, then speak out a truth that maybe you don't feel, but speak it out in the hope and faith of who he is, I mean, and this is what I love, Stephanie, what you're saying, and through the story and in your book, like, this is the real life. This is what this is about. This is how we're also going to get through short-term illness, but also, friends of mine, Stephanie, who are dealing with this long-term. It's been years of this pain and grief with your parent or loved one. And for others, some of my friends, it's been short and a shock. And
which is its own battle.
And so what you're saying is really good and healthy.
And I just want to say one more thing. You can be angry without being angry at God. And I think Jesus, like, when Jesus wept, he was angry. I think he was angry at sin. He was angry at the way sin had broken the world he created, like angry. And I think when we feel angry, it feels a bit overwhelming, and we just feel like I must direct it at somebody. And anger can come out and just be out. It doesn't have to be, I'm so mad at this person. And of course, the tension with God is, if you are all good and you are all powerful, how do I make sense of this? Because you could stop this, but you're for some reason, choosing not to. And just the simplest way I can illustrate that, I remember when my oldest was getting immunizations and getting needles, and I remember having to like just kind of hold her down. And I remember as they're like putting the needle in her arm, I just remember like looking at me and tears in her eyes. And it was this face that was like, why are you letting them hurt me? Like, why are you allowing, like, you're sitting there, you could stop them. You could stop this. Why? And I just remember saying, trust me, just hold on. It's not going to last forever. Oh,
that's good.
Hang on. And of course, of course, everyone has mixed feelings about immunizations probably, but you understand on the whole, this short-term something will have a greater gain.
And help you in the long run. From getting XYZ.
And so I think,
right.
One of the things I did do in that season was like, what does the Bible actually say? Because people say all kinds of things to try to be helpful when you're grieving. But to go, okay, God, what do you say about suffering? And like, what do you say about who you are? And how am I to interpret the things that you're allowing? And I remember just thinking, if it's in the Bible, I want it. Like, if it's not, like, I don't want to name and claim something that's not mine, that you haven't promised, but I want whatever you have for me to get through this season. And so that became very prominent.
And that's good. And I think going back to like, when we look at sometimes it can feel like it's a unique experience for me.
Yeah.
I am feeling this, and oh my goodness, why me? Why? And then you go, wait a second. So many people are going through the same thing, and not to disregard your feeling, but when you look at scripture, when you look at other people and their stories, you can read through to say people made it through.
Yeah.
People made it through.
Yeah.
People got to the other side.
Yeah.
As you're dealing with grief or loss, like there are beautiful, rich stories in the Bible and through other books and through people around you who have made it and have come out stronger and have come out with a different theology of suffering, a different and a deeper relationship with God and their family, a deeper, honest relationship with themselves as they've gone through this. And so it's hard to say now when you're so blinded by grief and just pain. But I think right now, Stephanie, as we're talking, for those who are listening and watching, to say, you can make it, you will make it.
You will be okay.
And you will be okay. And maybe the thing to look forward to is you may come out of this as a different person with deeper empathy, with a deeper relationships in many areas. You know what I mean? And so it's hard to say that because right now we need to sit in the grief, feel it, express it, share it. And so that I'm not, saying not to do that. I'm saying in that space right now for those that are in that. Yeah. But also, and you will get through this. And I think that's hopeful. Yeah. And absolutely. God is with you in that. That's it. So let me go to this. I think also within your story, there's also, and as I'm getting older, this talk and importance of legacy. Let's just talk about that, because this legacy of hope in the decisions you make and how you live your life. Legacy. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's an important question to ask. I think to just always begin asking, I don't think it's ever too early. What am I leaving behind me? What am I leaving for the people coming? And of course, I think the most obvious earthly, right, is you go, okay, I want to in the world's eyes, build so my kids have an inheritance, right? So I have something to pass on to them. And we were recently on a vacation and just standing on the ocean. And my 3-year-old we were standing on the sand, and then this wave came. And, and when the tide comes out, it pulls, you're standing on this ground and it feels pretty solid. And then the tide comes in, and all of a sudden the sand under your feet starts, and I remember a couple of times she almost lost her balance, and she was like, what, kind of like, what's happening? And, 3 years old, I remember just taking the time to say, this is why Jesus said to build our house on the rock. And I think when you talk about legacy, you're like, yes, absolutely, like build things, like leave them to your children. But you think like, what is going to matter in eternity? And I think there's nothing quite like suffering to make you start thinking about that, because suffering does this funny thing where all of a sudden you don't love your earthly life so much. All of a sudden you're like, this is hard and painful. And I remember as a kid, like, I don't want to die. I want to live, and I want to experience this and experience that. And this life is so good. And when you experience suffering, you start to go, oh, this world's kind of broken and it's hard. And you start to have this longing for heaven and the day when God says, there will be no more tears. There will be no more pain. And as you begin to look in the scriptures, like it says, like your suffering, not that your suffering's nothing, but compared to the glory that will be revealed, it's going to be nothing. Like one day, not today, but one day. The scriptures say that this testing comes to refine our faith in 1 Peter, and our faith is of greater worth than gold. Like when you think about that, you don't get the phone call like that and go, this is a golden opportunity. Like this is the opportunity of a lifetime. But when you begin to look from an eternal perspective and go, okay, what matters most to God? What 3 things are going to remain? Faith, hope, and love. So I could leave my kids everything this world has to offer, but if I don't show them, if I don't give them, if I don't point them to the things that are going to last, then, within a generation, whatever I pass them's gone. I mean, max, like their name, and what's so interesting about my dad, like he had from the world standpoint, like he really had nothing. Like he wasn't wealthy, he wasn't well known, he wasn't famous. People would not have been like, he's an influencer, he's got, you know, it was like before Twitter and Instagram, Facebook, like
he doesn't
all those
have
things.
like a million followers.
Doesn't have like a million followers,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And he said to me in that season, he said, Stephanie, kingdom impact is about quality,
Nice.
not quantity. And that, I mean, so many things, but it's so interesting because, you know, 13, 14 years later now, this ordinary guy who was a Filipino and an immigrant and a mechanic to a pastor, it's like, why are people still talking about him? It's not because he was so rich or so, like, because he drove nice cars and we went on, like, we didn't have any of that. It's because he loved them well. It's because he held on to his faith, and because he continually offered people the hope that's found in Christ. And so I think about legacy a lot, and I think I want faith to be like, if there's anything I could pass to my children, it's like I want to hold their little faces and say, I want you to know God is who he says he is, and God can do what he says he can do, and you are who God says you are, and in Christ you can do anything God calls you to. And, you know, so when you think about what am I doing today that's investing in that, all of a sudden my list becomes not that important. You know, I mean, yeah, like put in a load of laundry, but don't forget like the things that are going to last, the things that you actually want to leave behind you. And in the book, there's 4 chapters. I mean, it's my dad's story, but there's 4 chapters that are my first person, and they're from May 2008 when I was wrestling. And the things I was wrestling with of like, okay, you know, should we move home? Should we just drop everything and move home? And my dad said, no, Stephanie, you need to be where God's calling you to be. You need to be on mission with him. And then being able to actually like jump back into his story and go, he modeled that. Like each one of those of my wrestlings, I didn't have to look very far to find the example. I could just look back on his life and go, what did he, and he wasn't perfect by any stretch. Like he was very human, had lots of quirks and, you know, just like different things, but he modeled what he was telling us, and there was consistency in that. And so that was impactful for me to think, okay, the ceiling of his faith is our floor, you know, like the things he fought for and the things he believed about God. It's like we get to stand on those, and then we get to live our lives of faith, and then our kids get to, you know, have. And so I think legacy is so important, so powerful, and something that we need to keep very much in the forefront of our minds.
I love that. Biggest lesson from your dad's journey? I love that anything but ordinary, finding faith that works when life doesn't. So much in there, Stephanie, but you said a lot, but what would you say is your biggest lesson from your dad's journey as a takeaway, you know, for our listeners and viewers today?
It's always hard for me to pick one. You know,
I know.
What's your favorite this?
Okay, Stephanie, 2. You can do 2.
Okay.
I'll give you 2.
Yeah, well, one actually, you know, somebody the other day was like, oh, I know you wrote this book to honor your dad. And I actually said, no, that's actually not why I wrote it. I wrote it because I wanted to tell people how faithful God has been through a season, you know, how faithful he was in a season I didn't think I would survive. Like I said to my husband months before my dad was diagnosed, if anything ever happened to my dad, I would not be okay. Anything else. And God was and is faithful. And I'm like, I want to almost like prove that to you and go, here's some evidence about that. I want people to know that you can trust him. Like no matter how painful it is right now, no matter how confused you feel, no matter how you cannot see how this could possibly be used for your good and for his glory, when you're sitting, you know, and looking at your life and just feeling like it's either shattered in pieces or it feels just like dust, like, and going, I can't possibly see how God could redeem this. Yes, he can. Like, yes, he can. And so I think the biggest thing is just like God can be trusted, and you can trust him because he's trustworthy. You can trust him. Like you can hold out that tiny mustard seed and go, I don't feel like this is true. Like this is hard. This is sad. This is painful. And I'm willing to bless the name of God. I'm willing to say, I can't see it, but you're good. I can't feel it, but you're there. And just to hold out, you know, hold out that faith. It is possible. And God does not waste pain. He does not waste brokenness. He does not waste anything that you're willing to put in his hands and say, I can't do anything with this, but here you go. He doesn't waste any of it.
Amazing. So beautiful. You know, Sophie, it gives me pause because, I mean, right now, both of my parents are still alive. But I do have, I'll be honest, like anxiety about when one of my parents passes away, or if they're diagnosed the next while with anything. I mean, they're in the 80s now, and so I'm very aware. And so this is so good because I just feel like our conversation has kind of prepared me, you know, bit, and your book to prepare me. So your book is so good for those that are now going through that, have gone through it, or even for me now that know that they will go through it, that there will be a moment, like, you know, we're at the stage now in, if you're 30s, 40s, or any stage where you could lose a parent. And it's so good and rich. It's such a good conversation that we're having, but also that I'm grateful for you to take the time and choose to write the story of your dad, and for him, for us, for you. You know, it's so good. Where can we pick up the book? Anything but ordinary.
Amazon.
Okay, Amazon. Okay.
It's in some Christian bookstores. But you can go, the first place you can go is anythingbutordinarybook.ca. And from there, you know, you can kind of choose where you want to go. But that will just, you know, kind of let you know where you can find it. And also you can download the first 3 chapters if you're like not really sure yet, if you want to read it. But anythingbutordinarybook.ca. And then, you know, all the online places too is where you can find it.
Amazing. Stephanie, thank you so much. Thank you for your thoughts. There's so many good things, as you can see. I mean, for the listeners, you can't, but I've scrubbed all of these like things that you've said that I'm like, oh, that is so good. You know, God is faithful. Exercise faith. It's faith, hope, and love. You know, like it's so good. And thank you so much. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Thank you for this conversation. It's been such a blessing.
Yeah. And thank you too to our See Your Love community for joining us today. I hope you were strengthened, and that as you go through grief and loss, or the long journey of saying goodbye, know that you're not alone, that you can get through really hard things, and that you are seen, you are heard, and you are deeply loved by God. Thank you so much for joining us.